The American Indian Movement is an Indian civil rights organization founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1968. It was founded by Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, Eddie Benson Benai, and George Mitchell. Later, Russell Means would become a spokesman for the group. The group first came together to address Native American affirmation, treaty issues, spirituality, and leadership. However, their biggest goal was to create economic independence for Indians. They also addressed incidents of police brutality and racism against indigenous people who were being forced to leave reservations and tribal culture by the Indian termination policies. The termination policy was a U.S. policy from the mid-1940s to the mid-60s that had the main goal of getting indigenous people away from their culture and into the real world. The government wanted these people to pay state and federal taxes, which they had been previously exempt from. AIM was committed to improving the conditions that Native people faced, so they founded many different institutions to fulfill their needs. Some notable institutions include the American Indian Opportunities and Industrialization Center, Indian Legal Rights Centers, and the International Indian Treaty Council. One of the most common ways that AIM fought for justice was protests. Three major protests that AIM was involved in were the occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969, the March on Washington in 1972, and the protests at Wounded Knee in 1973. The occupation of Alcatraz Island was a 19-month protest that started in 1969, where 89 American Indians and their supporters occupied Alcatraz. The protest was led by Richard Oakes, Lenata Means, and spokesperson John Trudeau. After a fire burnt down the San Francisco American Indian Center, the group decided to set their sights on Alcatraz. The American Indians wanted to build a school and a museum on the island, and their argument was that they founded the island. Tons of people joined them on the island, and many people sent out food and water. At times, 600 people occupied the island in protest. The people in the island protested that under the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 between the U.S. and the Lakota, all retired, abandoned, or out-of-use federal island was returned to Native people who once occupied it. The Native people founded this land, and they now wanted it back. But after many months of protest, it was ended by the U.S. government. During the March on Washington in October 1972, 7 Indian movements, including AIM, came together in Washington, D.C. to protest. The protest became known as the Trail of Broken Treaties, and during the protest, Indian authors wrote a 21-point proposal that focused on proposals which intended to strengthen the United States-Indian relations. The protest started on the West Coast, and protesters traveled by car, bus, and van to D.C. They got there a week before the presidential election, and they planned on sharing their proposal with Nixon. The Nixon administration refused to meet with protesters, so they decided to occupy the Department of Interior headquarters building, where they started to vandalize and burn papers. Because of this, the Nixon administration finally agreed to meet with the protesters. During the talks, the federal government assured the protesters that they would start treaty negotiations once again. The 1973 Wounded Knee incident was the most violent protest of them all. The incident began on February 27th after an attempt to impeach tribal president Richard Wilson failed. Following the failure, 200 members of Oglala Lakota and followers of AIM seized and occupied the town of Wounded Knee. Protesters started to criticize the U.S. government and its failure to fulfill treaties with Native American people, and they demanded that treaty negotiations were reopened. The occupation lasted 71 days, and the aftermath included 2 Indians who were dead and many casualties among federal government forces. In the mid-1970s, AIM's efforts were centered on the prevention of resource exploitation of Indian lands by the federal government. With many of its leaders in prison and torn by internal dissension, the national leadership disbanded in 1978. Local groups continue to function, and they are still functioning today.